Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's still morning for me. We would like to welcome everyone to this IPR webinar, Financial Services, What COVID-19 Has Taught Us About Trust and the Path Forward, co-hosted by the Institute for Public Relations in Edelman. My name is Tina McCorkindale, and I'm the president and CEO of the Institute. We are a nonprofit research foundation, and we do research that matters to the profession in corporate communication and public relations. Before we begin, please note we will have time for a Q&A with our speakers at the end of the webinar. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A box. If at any time you have questions, just click on the box and type in your questions there. We will collect the questions and moderate them at the end of the webinar. Please only ask your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, as questions can get lost in the chat. You're welcome to use the chat. The session is being recorded, and we will also send an email with all the resources at the end of this presentation. And that'll take just like a couple days. But I'm very excited about our panel today and everyone who's joining us. So here with me today, I get to introduce our amazing moderator, and that is our IPR trustee and chair of the financial services sector at Edelman, Deidre Campbell. Hi, Deidre. Thank you so much for your partnership, and I look forward to moderating this fantastic webinar.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Tina, Nikki, and to IPR for getting us all here. We've got a fantastic panel lined up, which I'm very excited to introduce you to. But first, we'll take a couple of minutes to spin through some data. We'll just get that up on the screen here now. If those of you who are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, this is 20 years of global research measuring trust. Next slide, please. We measure trust at Edelman across business, government, NGOs, and the media. This is a global survey. It's in the field between October and November of 2020. So if you think about what was going on in the world between October and November of last year, that will kind of give you a sense of how respondents were feeling. We surveyed the mass population, but we also pull out the top 15% of income earners, college educated, between the age of 25 and 64, to get a sense of how those two populations are experiencing the world. And in fact, in 2016, the Edelman Trust Barometer absolutely foretold the populist movement. So some interesting findings there. When we measured trust in 2019, it was, sort of like the world was still normal. By February of that year, the trust barometer was completely irrelevant, and everything was upside down, and nothing made sense anymore. So in May, next slide, please, we went back into the field to see where trust in financial services and really across the barometer actually was sitting. And trust was quite high in financial services, up in the sort of 65 range. But then has very quickly, after many years of building trust, is here very low at 52. To give you a sense of sort of what these numbers mean, you are in the trusted category at 60. So if you'll see there, trust in business is almost in the trusted category here in 2021, while trust in financial services is quite low at 52, and as low as it's been in many, many years. Next slide, please. As we measure trust in 27 countries, you'll see that financial services is not trusted in 20 of these 27 countries. Let's say US is sort of middling there at 54, down 2 points from last year. I guess we'll take 2 points after everything we've been through. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, government, business, NGOs, and media, you see there that May piece of research. We've never before have we gone out into the market like that. It's always an annual occurrence, but this year, for relevancy's sake, and you'll see that having come off that trust bubble, these are US numbers that you're looking at here, down in every category, but significantly down in media and government. But again, if you think about what was going on between October and November of last year, it was a pretty unsettling time. Next slide, please. These are those numbers that I mentioned, that top bar being informed public and the bottom mass population. So among a mass population, and this a global number, financial services has entered the distrusting category, which is really disappointing, especially coming off trusted category, just barely getting into the trusted category in May, and then just, having a trust collapse. Even among informed public, you see a dip there of 9 points. I'm hopeful, and we are going back into the field again mid-year, that we're going to see a rebound and people are feeling a lot better with the economy and the vaccine and distribution and health rates and so forth. So we'll stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. We measure a lot of sectors at Edelman. Financial services here is the next to last. Fortunately, we are now measuring social media as a sector, so we're not dead last as we have been, but again, they're in the sort of middling category, but down 5 points. Next slide, please. We'll look at some subsectors. They tell different stories. I think for insurance here, it is, it's interesting to see that trust is down in property, casualty, and personal, but it's up in the United States. And certainly the insurance industry has done a good job of helping people get through these difficult times. You've seen the auto insurers giving back premiums very early on without even being asked, because people didn't get in their car and go anywhere. And I think personal insurance has certainly been there to help through these difficult health times. Next slide, please. Banks in the US are up while they're down globally. Same for credit cards. I think that this is because these banking and credit was seen as an economic first responder and continues to be in helping people get through the crisis and manage the PPP loans and be there on a lending point of view to keep folks out of predatory lenders. Next slide, please. Financial advisory, while it's down, and digital wealth management also down, it's my view that it's not that people don't trust their advisors or their wealth management tools. I think the markets were just super jittery and people didn't have a lot of confidence in their investment strategies and where they were headed and how much of it was out of their control. And next slide, please. And we're looking at crypto. We've been looking at crypto for 3-4 years now. I think it's interesting to see that, crypto is still largely distrusted across the world, but really interesting to see where is crypto trusted. And it's trusted, in countries that really look to see their capital being more flexible and being able to move in and out of different jurisdictions more easily and without a lot of regulation. So with that, next slide, please. Let's talk. So great. We'll pull down the deck, and I'd like to introduce you to our fabulous panel that includes Arati Randolph, Executive Vice President of CEO and Corporate Communications at Wells Fargo, also an IPR trustee. Paul Gennaro, Senior Vice President of Brand and Corporate Communications and Chief Communications Officer at Voya Financial, also an IPR trustee. And Arielle Patrick, Chief Communications Officer of Ariel Investments. Great. So with that, I'll open it up with just a general question here and let each of you take a stab at it. But, looking at those trust numbers and thinking what they mean for your own business, but also what it means for folks like us who spend all of our time thinking about communications. Why don't I start with you, Arielle, and in terms of your perspective of this data, being an Edelman alum, I know you know trust well, and give us your thoughts, please.
Sure. Thanks so much, Deidre, as well as IPR for having us. This is a great discussion and a good way to break up what I'm calling Zoom fatigue that we're all feeling. I think generally I'm unfazed by the data because at Ariel, we have been tracking trust in the industry for quite some time, and it's particularly critical when it comes to diverse communities. Just last month, we finished our 20th annual survey with Schwab, which showed that only about 35% of African-American investors feel that they're treated with respect by the financial services industry, which actually contributes to the very large disparity between Black and white investors as it relates to their exposure to the stock market. And of course, that's only from a DEI perspective, but I think what's underneath all of that is that through COVID, we became abundantly aware of the fact that beneath all of this frustration and lack of trust in corporate America, particularly the financial services industry, is economic inequality. That is the driving force beyond what became a reckoning in this country. And I think more and more we're realizing that the private sector, meaning corporations, financial services companies, are being held accountable for making change as it relates to social issues, more so than government. So at Ariel, what we call it is civil rights 3.0. 1.0 was the Emancipation Proclamation. 2.0 was the 60s with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And now in 3.0, government is no longer held responsible for taking the lead. It's actually the private sector because the laws are in place. But in order for society to particularly change, industries, including ours, have to take the lead. So I'll say not surprised and happy to talk more about the data.
Thank you. Arati, certainly banking on the front lines of all of this. How do you feel about these trust numbers and expectations for the future, and how are you guys managing through the heavy role that banking is playing through the crisis?
Yeah, well, thank you, Deirdre, and thank you again for having us on. So I think Ariel made some great points, and I think the point around the decline in trust in so many other institutions, like government, for example, and maybe less of a decline in business, and financial services, particularly in the US, are sort of in that range, right, in terms of the level of trust. I do think it says a lot about actually how far the US financial system has come. If you think about the financial crisis, whatever, 10, 12 years ago, and you really think about all of that reckoning at the time and where big banks in particular were, I do think there has been some gain. And if I think about how banks have responded to the crisis at hand in terms of the pandemic, there have been a lot of positives in terms of how they've taken care of employees, helped customers, et cetera. And you're seeing as banks and businesses are required to have more of a voice and action in societal issues, I think that's all coming forward as well. And I know we'll talk more about specifics, but I think it's encouraging.
Fantastic. So as we think about the roles and that really sort of vocal advocacy that John Rogers and Melanie Hobson are playing to close that racial wealth gap, Ariel, can you talk a little bit about what you think CEOs, with the expectations of CEOs and speaking on social issues and really doing more than speaking? Certainly our trust data shows that is the expectation of CEOs, but love your view on what's happening at Ariel and who you think's doing it well.
So I think taking it a step back beyond our firm, we all know as communications experts that what stakeholders want are two things: transparency and results. What that means is if you have a goal and you've not yet met it as a CEO, in the same way that you would with financial results or strategic plans as it relates to other things like DEI, the E part of ESG as well as the G, it's about actually admitting that, setting a plan, creating metrics, measurement, and keeping your stakeholders updated on the process. I think the worst thing that we saw, particularly after George Floyd, was that a lot of CEOs gave a lot of lip service, but little follow-up, and also veiled the fact that in many cases their institutions weren't close to where they needed to be. So I think that's step one. But as it relates to Ariel, we're taking our role quite seriously in two ways. One, as a participant in the financial services industry, but also as shareholders of some of the world's largest companies. So we've implemented a new ESG proxy voting policy, which means we'll vote against the nominating and governance chair or equivalent of a board if they lack female or minority representation. We were quite vocal when NASDAQ initially submitted their proposal for more transparency around board diversity. And as it relates to the other parts of the ESG spectrum, we're making changes not only in terms of how we engage with our portfolio companies. A lot of that involves encouragement and ongoing dialogue, as opposed to simply using our power as shareholders to make our point clear through voting. And then internally at the firm, we've changed a lot of our policies so that our employees are also our biggest evangelists on behalf of the firm and walk the walk in the same way that we do at the management and portfolio management level.
So Paul, thank you, Ariel. Paul, in terms of the way that you guys look at trust at Voya and really like what matters, I'd love to hear from you sort of the lens that you guys apply and also your feeling about the role of the CEO and what you guys are doing in particular.
Yeah, I think so a couple things. One, I think the Edelman Trust results that came out this year certainly validated what at least we saw on the ground during the course of last spring, summer, and fall, as far as employees looking for us to be able to drive change and society being able to look to us to drive change. From a trust standpoint in financial services, and I think everybody would agree, there's nothing more important. One of the things that we did a couple of years ago at the end of our broadcast TV commercials, we've been fortunate enough to earn the world's most ethical companies designation for now 8 consecutive years. So we put that logo up at the end of our broadcast TV commercials, and the response was really positive. Now, we actually tested it, world's most ethical companies against Fortune Most Admired, and world's most ethical outperformed it by a 2-to-1 margin, which somewhat surprised us because I'm in New York, I'm in the corporate world, and I know how laudable world's most admired is. However, what we saw, if you look across general consumers, this idea of being ethical and being world's most ethical was really a driver, and it's caused us to outperform in interest in doing business, and it's also caused us to outperform in trust in the brand. So that's been really significant for us. To your question on the CEO, you know, I lucked into a situation with an incredible CEO in Rod Martin. So he inherited a board that was 100% white male, and in 2.5 years got to gender parity with independent directors, brought people of color on the board. So he's been a leader there. We talk about people with disabilities and special needs. Rod's been out in front of that as well. So I think society is looking for that. Certainly our employees, our biggest constituency, are looking to that. And I think CEOs and companies have an opportunity now to act. And if we don't, we're missing a big opportunity to drive change.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly agree more. And I say a lot to clients and to folks when I'm presenting this data. We talk about it's important to come out on social issues, and it's important for CEOs to do that. And often I'll have communicators say, "Hey, look, there's no way I'm doing that because no matter what I say, I'm going to perhaps offend 50% of our population." We know, based on the presidential results, it's very clearly divided. But I think what our trust data tells us is the number one thing in terms of building trust is keeping my family safe and helping my family's needs. And I think that's pretty apple pie. And in terms of financial services, I tell clients what you do every day is keeping people's families safe. When you protect retirement, when you protect capital markets, when you protect people's access to financial services products and lending, you're doing a social service, because the financial services industry is very much needed to make the world safe and sound for families. So how you communicate what you're doing, and we're getting better at it over the decades, I think. We're no longer sort of talking in fine print from ivory towers, but really becoming more human in that voice. It's great to see that communicators are really have a seat at the table in a way that we have not. I think about, Paul, what you guys are doing as it relates to, employees and customers during the pandemic and making people feel sort of, safe through the crisis. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think if we look at our employees, in my opinion, I think the value proposition for employees really changed dramatically in last year. It went from 10 years ago, employees wanted compensation, to then employees wanted to work for a company that had a purpose and made them feel good, to now employees want to work for a company that makes them feel safe. Now, we saw that during the pandemic when our virtual town halls had near 100% participation with employees because they didn't know who to trust, whether it was the government or the media. They were looking for the employer. Tell us what we need to believe. Can we go back to the office? What should we be doing? And then we saw that in the summer, right? With George Floyd, we saw employees saying, we're coming to work because it's our safe place. And that's where we can feel supported and empathy from management and leadership. And I think that's a big opportunity. And then the other one I think even continues now is mental health. So if you look at the numbers from CDC, right? The numbers don't lie. 40% of overall individuals feeling increased anxiety. You break it down by age category, you extrapolate, in our case, 6,000 employees, you know people are going through this and they're counting you for their mental health. So when we've got our CEO out there saying, look, I want you to take breaks. I want you to spend time teaching your children if they're doing remote schooling, taking breaks to spend time with your spouse, it really does matter. And we've seen it in our employee data. Our employee data, we had a good culture, I would say, prior to everything that took place in the last year. Every single one of our employee indicators went up year over year at a time when you would think everything would go down. So I think that's really the opportunity for the employer and specifically for the CEO to lead the way.
Very cool. Ariel, we know that you're somewhat new in your role at Ariel Investments. So sort of bringing that fresh perspective, how would you describe the culture and how they've been able to, you as a company have been able to come together to band folks through the crisis?
Great question. Well, I think a big thing to recognize is that we have been quite vocal with our entire workforce about the fact that we're in what we're calling Ariel 2.0. Our firm has experienced significant growth and opportunity throughout the pandemic, which of course is a bit unlike other peers in the industry. And so a big part of it is keeping people updated on our not only financial, but corporate progress, more so than we probably would. We're now having all staff meetings more and more frequently, engaging the employee base more than ever. It was funny, Melody said on our meeting right before this that we have now over 100 offices. We've grown in that way too. So realizing that people have been feeling siloed and doing everything that we can to reach across the aisle and bring people together. As it relates to our communications function, a big part, my arrival at the firm couldn't have been better timed because before I started, we were a bit fragmented. So historically, marketing sat within our investor relations practice. Employee communications was handled by HR. The media relations group was stood on its own. Philanthropy was over here. Events were over here. And so what I implemented was a pretty large scale restructuring, but gelling of all of those groups. So now what were previously 6 or 7 groups are all in one. And what that does is it helps us ensure that we have a seamless, transparent, and effective way of communicating, not only internally, but also externally with all of our stakeholders, ensuring it's consistent, but also diversified. Whereas I think if we had kept our old structure in the pandemic, that would have been pretty impossible. So I think that's really helped us build trust with not only employees, but other stakeholders, because they're hearing from us more and they're hearing a lot of the same data at the same time, and no one feels left out.
I have a question for you, Arati, but I do want to encourage folks to be putting Q&A in the chat. Certainly a lot we can learn from these communicators. So would love to know what's on your mind. So please just drop them into the chat. We will be turning to them momentarily. But Arati, I wanted to ask you, well, first let me just say, the only number that is consistent in the Edelman Trust Barometer year over year over year over year is while the financial services sector tends to linger at the bottom of all the sectors that we survey, the financial service employees of financial services companies trust their employer to do the right thing more than any other sector we survey. And why do you think that is, or at least from a Wells Fargo perspective? And how have you, both in your role as CEO, communications and corporate communications, been able to make sure that maintains sort of a solid foundation of trust for your employees?
Yeah, well, we absolutely try to be very timely, relevant, and authentic in terms of communications with our employees. And we have lots of different forums in terms of communicating. We talked about, Paul had talked about CEO town halls, et cetera. So there are a lot of things we do on a very regular cadence. And I think people appreciate the information. And when we don't know something, we tell them that we don't know. I do think the other thing, to me, the trend around misinformation out there in the world is really disturbing. And I do think that is also another contributor in terms of people trusting their institution and their employer more in terms of, give me the facts. And so it's all the more important, I think, for us to be timely and relevant and authentic and transparent in our communications. I also think, and we've touched on this, that the way employers have responded to the pandemic and the way Wells did, like within days, right? And we're a year this week, so we're seeing a lot of anniversary coverage of the pandemic. But I remember when we went ahead and closed most of our offices, we transitioned 200,000 people to work from home very quickly. And it was really kind of an amazing feat. And the folks that were on the front lines and the branches that we kept open, we were really careful around, keeping them clean, ensuring social distancing, making sure they had everything they needed to feel safe in serving customers. And all the other actions in terms of enhanced childcare, in terms of more money for frontline workers, in terms of, millions of dollars going to our We Care Fund, which is our employer relief fund. All of those actions, I think, really add up, right, for folks. I think Deirdre, you'd mentioned taking care of families, right? I think people felt like the company absolutely cared about their safety, about their well-being, about their family safety, and it made a difference.
Paul, I'd love to hear kind of your take. We all marveled at how easily we went to this work from home model. I know even at Edelman, we've been on Microsoft Teams for years and I'd never paid any attention to it. And I sat down and was like, show me Microsoft Teams. and in an instant, we were all connected, and we're more integrated as a result. We work across every region in a way that we never have. We've deepened relationships with colleagues that we might not have when we thought you had to sit across the table from someone to really get to know them. And so there's been that benefit. But Paul, my question to you is, what about getting them back? How are you thinking about that? Is it a hybrid approach? How are you guys kind of exploring return to the office and the communications around that?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about a crisis is it tests your values and your culture. Is it real, or is it just things that are written down on the website or in the annual report? Throughout the last 12 months, we've guided ourselves on what's the best thing for our people. So like everyone else, that started with, let's get people out of the office, let them work from home immediately. And then as we looked at people being able to take breaks, encouraging them to take PTO, mental health we talked about. Then when it came back to coming back to the office, it was, this is what we're thinking, but you have the option to opt out if you're not comfortable for any reason. Now, right now, we have less than 10% of our employees, very few people in the office right now. We set a date, I think, of July 12th. I wouldn't be surprised if that doesn't get pushed out, but that's for the next phase. At the same time, we went to all 6,000 employees, and this is at the urging of our CEO. He said, tell us what you want. So as an example, my options were, I can be in the office 4 to 5 days a week. I can be remote 100% of the time. I could be a hybrid primary office or primary remote. And what we saw is we went into this with about 20% of our 6,000 employees remote all the time. We're expecting that number to go up to 40 or 60%. So we're really leaning into this and looking at what have we learned technology-wise, what have we learned? And we think it's a benefit when it comes to recruiting. We talk about from a D&I perspective, I'm no longer limited to hiring to the geography around an office. So if I can employ people that are anywhere in the country, it opens up a lot of possibilities. I mentioned before, people with disabilities and special needs, where maybe the commute was the barrier, or maybe it's a parent that needed to stay home because the kids came home from school at 2 o'clock. Now you've opened up an incredibly wide spectrum of workforce. We think it's a huge opportunity. So it's something that we're actually leaning into. I know I'm on chief of staff monthly call with other financial services chiefs of staff, so I wear that hat as well. And we've got some companies that are leaning in like that. And then we have some that want to get back as soon as possible. So we're seeing some variance, but we're leaning towards the future, we believe.
Interesting. So Ariel, recognizing that you guys are obviously institutional, can you talk about, digital transformation from the perspective of institutional investors through COVID?
Good question. I mean, I think we view the institutional client audience the way we treat them the same way that, a financial services branch would treat a retail investor. It's a family feel. We pride ourselves on the fact that we're the kind of firm where we still write handwritten notes to everybody along with all of our reporting. So that touch hasn't gone away. In fact, I think it's increased. And it's really made people feel quite special. I remember when we sent our holiday card out, we got overwhelming feedback because we had basically created this expandable accordion that had the Zoom screenshot photo of every single person at our firm. So I don't know, it's helping us get more creative about client engagement, but we're not losing touch of sort of the old school paper piece, because I think the institutional audience values that a bit more than maybe the retail audience might. So we just don't rely on digital exclusively as maybe other firms have been. But as it relates to investment behavior, I think that train already left the station pre-COVID. So I don't know that I think that the pandemic has enhanced a reliance on digital for our clients necessarily. We're a bit old school, so I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So just last question before I go to the Q&A, but Arati, I know, customer experience is like so core to what you guys think about and do at Wells Fargo. And before the pandemic, there was all this talk about the future of branch banking, and then COVID happened and turned everybody, upside down for a while. And how are you viewing that now through that customer experience lens?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've done a lot of research, right, in terms of trust and trust among all audience, et cetera. And certainly taking care of your customers and listening to their needs is really key in terms of building that trust. So a couple of things, I think we have adjusted a lot to customer needs during the pandemic in terms of, extending forbearance, waiving fees, et cetera, for millions of customers. So it's kind of short term, but really important to them. We've increased digital banking. We've seen customers use digital tools much more, significantly more, and we've tried to make those easier for people to use. So I think that's a trend that's going to stay. And I just think that's absolutely here to stay. So there's that. And then the other thing is we've done a lot of building out in terms of infrastructure in the company, in terms of how do we focus on the customer more. So for example, we've launched an Office of Consumer Practices that works closely with all our business lines in terms of really working with those business lines in terms of customer, being more focused on the customer, product development, procedures, policies, training, et cetera. And I think that's really important. We have a new customer feedback program. We have a new complaints management program. So making sure the infrastructure is there to support our 70 million plus customers and take it to the next level with them.
Okay, great. So I'll turn to the questions. Boy, we have a lot of tough questions. So I'll start with one for you, Paul, that specifically asking you, many CEOs say we encourage you to take the time you need, but they don't do it themselves and therefore send mixed messages. How did your CEO encourage employees to actually follow his advice?
No, that's a great question. So Rod certainly put the message out there. The other thing I think that Rod and several senior leaders across the organization did, they signed a pledge, and I forget the exact name of it, but call it a for lack of a better term, a work-life balance pledge, and really encourage people to take the time during the day, to take the time to get out of the house, to get away from the computer, to have the ability to flex their schedules. And then they also modeled that too. So you saw a lot of that. Also I know a lot of organizations doing this, a lot less scheduling of meetings on Fridays, making it clear that while we've got Zoom technology, for some meetings, Zoom is completely optional. And on top of that, showing up to the Zoom, wearing a t-shirt or wearing a baseball cap and just kind of leading by example and trying to create that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can say at Edelman, I've seen some really interesting, innovative techniques instituted. One is called Dusk to Dawn, and it's no emails, or certainly unnecessary emails between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Although I think some more junior people took that to mean, you mean I got to work till 8 p.m. every night? And I think it was just to reduce that traffic. There's also this thing that we do called the Blue Zone. It's from 1 to 3 Eastern time every day, no meetings, just to allow people to like answer their inbox, think, read, take a walk. Then there's also this other tool called No Meetings Friday, and every other Friday, unless it's a client, that needs to meet, but no unnecessary internal meetings, because we just sit here from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to give people a chance. Now that doesn't happen 100% of the time, of course, but the pockets when it actually works, it's just giant relief. So I think kudos to our HR team that's helping us. But but the senior leaders, we have to model that behavior, right? Let's see. How about this one for you, Arati? What should communications professionals be doing now to meet societal changes due to COVID? What should we stop doing as well? So what should communications professionals be doing to meet social changes due to COVID? I think you've sort of talked about some of those in the future of banking, but do you have any more thoughts, or any of the other of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about that a lot. I mean, again, I think frequent relevant communications key. I think COVID has taught us that communicating with the employee, your employee group frequently is really key. Listening to what they really need and responding to that is really key. And so I think that's important. Just in terms of larger social issues, I mean, I think one of the reasons trust is, you're seeing more trust in businesses and financial services is that I do think businesses are listening more to societal needs and social needs. And so one example is we just made a big, climate change announcement, right? And so we've said we're going to get to net zero on greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and we're going to launch an institute to make sure to help our clients kind of get there too. And we know it's a transition. So, but that's just kind of one example of listening much more and really thinking about, even when it's complex, really thinking about how do we make it work? How do we make it work with our stakeholders? How do we make, and even if it's sort of long-term, just sort of putting all those steps in place and then being willing to draw a line in the sand and take a stand on some pretty aggressive actions.
I think the other thing I would say, if you're no matter what level of the communications construct you sit in at your organization, I think it's important to realize that in 2021, we have to treat ESG, DEI, sort of, I know we use these terms interchangeably, but social issues with the same level of gravity that we do meeting earnings guidance or executing on a strategic plan. I mean, historically, the E, the S, and the G were metrics where if a CEO failed to meet their target, they could still keep their job. But that's certainly not the case with financial or strategic matters. Now we're actually shifting to a phase where, in order to stay relevant and serve your stakeholders as a 21st century company, you actually have to treat these things with the same level of gravity. So that includes showing real measurable results, or at least admitting when you haven't, and setting goals, and keeping people updated on how you're tracking, as opposed to just saying we're trying over and over again. So we're in this a phase now where society actually holds corporates responsible, not just employees, but also clients, customers, and just the general public. And some folks may call it cancel culture. I would say it's a really positive development. And so, if you're a comms person, I think, don't view it as do-gooderism or philanthropy, view it as your responsibility on behalf of the management team and the corporation itself to treat it with the same level of seriousness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if I could just add quickly, I don't think that there's ever been a better time in my lifetime to have the job that all we have, whether it's brand communications, marketing, because you're looked at to be able to drive that type of messaging and change. I will tell you, our CEO, you mentioned it with investors, our CEO during quarterly earnings calls, he has our chairman, he does the one slide that's kind of the key themes. The next slide is key achievements when it comes to sustainability, ESG. We were fortunate to be named Barron's #1 financial services firm on ESG for their top 100 3 years in a row. That's the stuff we're talking about all the time. So I think it has become what we're focused on.
Fantastic. This is a great question. I think this is for each of you, and it's very sort of individual and a bit personal, I think. How has the adjustment been for you, shifting from in-person work to remote work? Or how has it, if it has, changed your relationship with your team and your staff? Has it enhanced your relationships or vice versa, or no change for you? Paul, you want to pick that up?
Sure. So how has it changed for me? I put on about 15 pounds. Okay. So I didn't walk very much when I walked to the office, but apparently it was a lot. So that's one, it's changed. To the second part of the question, I think it's really enhanced things with our employees. Our CEO just talked about it on a video. You're seeing into people's homes, you're seeing their children, you're seeing their pets. It becomes much closer and it's much more genuine and authentic. And I think the opportunity to care and to demonstrate to you as a leader, I care for you and your well-being, and I need you to take a break or spend some time with your kids or your family is really coming through. So in that sense, while we're geographically apart, I don't know that we've ever been closer together than we've become the last year.
Arati, what about you? Take that one.
I'm amazed by how seamless it's been, honestly. Like, I was on a plane pretty much every week before the pandemic hit. Wells Fargo is so spread out. And I haven't been on a plane since March of last year. But it has been amazing, I feel like, as we've just managed to seamlessly just do those meetings online or on Zoom and, connect and get the work done. So I hope we get a good mix going forward.
What about you, Ariel?
How has it changed for me? Same as Arati. I was on planes consistently. This is the most time I've slept in my bed in years. For my team, I think it's made us more creative and more integrated than ever. Of course, as I mentioned, there was that restructuring of our communications function, and I really embedded it into our institution at the top of the year more than it ever had been. So I have to acknowledge that part of that is because I joined and did this. But even more so, I think we have no choice but to get creative and think about ways to work better and sort of make sure that the communications function isn't a siloed sort of department of service to the rest of the firm, and actually more, a band leader partner with the rest of the group, both on the domestic and international research teams, as well as, through sales and all of our other functions. I think we're way more embedded than we've ever been because we're all in the same Zoom meetings and we're all just looking out for one another, honestly, and thinking, how can I make your life easier? I do get asked that question more than I remember earlier in my career. How can I help you? The question gets asked a lot more. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing that, but I think that's been a beautiful thing that's come out of this era for us.
Yeah, I would say for me personally, I mean, talk about on planes. I made Delta Diamond status in 2020 and I quit flying at the end of February. It's just crazy. But I learned, like, always being such a worker, that now, like, to be in your home all the time, you have to control that or it controls you. At some point, I remember thinking, when did working from home turn into living at the office? And all of this imparting this real sense of you've got to have greater balance in your life. For the people that you care about, for the issues that you care about, for self-care, and hopefully that stays with us. And then thinking about how you're caring for others in those teams. If you're feeling isolated and anxious, how are those junior teams feeling? Working from their bedrooms and their tiny little, apartments in some cases, and they live in big cities, like so many of us did. And some of it we did when we came up, but at least not facing a pandemic. So if I look back, one, sort of it's a theme of like hopefulness, and I'll ask each of you this. What are you most hoping, given that you're all US headquartered companies, what are you most hoping that we see out of the Biden administration in order to bring economic recovery to clients and communities? Who would like to take that one first?
I can start. I mean, I think we're already seeing it, right? Right? People are getting their first round of stimulus checks, or I mean, this round of stimulus checks this week. And I think with this rescue plan being passed, I think it's going to be really helpful. It's putting more money in the hands of consumers. The weather's getting warmer, the vaccine rollout is progressing. And I think you'll see people spending a lot more. I think you're going to see a lift to the economy. So I think things are kind of moving in the right direction.
Paul, do you have a thought about that?
No, I think in general, I think we need more unity, right? And I think I don't know what the answer is, so it's easy to identify the problem without the solution. But it would be nice to see more bipartisan votes on things, and I just think we need more unity as a nation, and hopefully we can get there over time.
I agree with that completely. And speaking of more unity, I think because Biden's in the White House, we're also going to see closer partnership between the public and private sector, because, generally, I think there will be more productive conversations, and I'm hoping that change that happens on Capitol Hill will, trickle into the boardroom more and more, particularly as it relates to the social issues we've been talking about.
Like 2 years ago, the Edelman Trust Barometer told us that something like 70% of the world was concerned about fake news being weaponized. And Arthi, you touched upon misinformation. We have a question here about how each of you are thinking about disinformation that is fueling this lack of unity in many cases, and how you're thinking about working in communication strategies that thwart disinformation, but also bring employees together and bringing customers together. Do you want to take a stab at that, Ariel?
Sure. I will say the very first thing that I said when I walked into the virtual doors of Ariel was that, and I say this as someone who greatly respects the media. My father is a member of the media. I trust journalism. I know a lot of people don't, but the first thing I said was we need to own our own narrative and talk to our stakeholders directly and not rely on third parties to tell our story for us. And that was sort of the first golden rule that's remained throughout how we're handling communications. It's a lot more direct. It's a lot more interactive. And it's simply not looking at the media as the main conduit to, engage with external audiences. It's simply not I think our tertiary communication strategy, if I were to look at the list of what we're prioritizing. And I'm sure it's similar for Arthi and Paul, but I'll let them chime in.
I agree. I think telling your own story is super important these days. I also think that sort of continuing to build relationships kind of all around is really important, right? Like you may continue to build relationships with the media is absolutely still key, and making sure you're educating people who are media, who are influencers, who are stakeholders. I think that continues to be really important.
Yeah, the only thing I agree with everything said is listening too. And I think that's incredibly important. So if you looked at immediately after the George Floyd situation occurred, our African-American ERG held an open forum for all of our employees, and our CEO joined just to listen. So the event took place for about an hour. And then at the end, Rod spoke and said, he had notes and he shared, this is what I heard you say. I'm listening, we hear you, and this is what we're going to do to act on that. So I think really that demonstrating that we're listening and we're here for that too, I think is really important.
So I'll ask each of you the last question from me and then turn it over to Tina and I'll give her the very last question or so. But we've talked about a lot. We've talked about return to work. We've talked about surviving through the pandemic, employees, ESG, racial equity. If you look at your 2021 communication strategy, what would you say your sort of number one area of focus is across, a real mosaic of issues that to tackle? So who would like to take that first? Okay.
I can start. Keyword integration. That's my priority number one. And that not only relates to how the different pieces of communications come together, but also ensuring that we are as embedded with throughout the firm as possible, and making sure that we're not cannibalizing opportunity by viewing things, different initiatives or different strategic priorities in silos. They all are connected and support one another. So
great. Arati.
Yeah, it's actually a great question, because I was just thinking I've got all these communications plans built out and kind of what's the unifying theme across them. And I think it's probably sort of more communication in general, right? I think that we have, again, we're living in a time that is so different, right? We've just been through this pandemic. We hope we're on the other side. We do have all these other social issues out there. And so in my mind, I think more communication to employees, more communication with customers, again, building those relationships across stakeholder groups is really, really going to be important.
Yeah, and I guess I'd frame it up. Our function is brand advertising, so broadcast, digital, search, social, traditional corp comm, research and insights, meetings and events, and then I wear a chief of staff hat. So it's kind of broad. What we're doing right now, we're going through the process. So we've got 3 operational pillars: brand and communications excellence, customer delight, and then team effectiveness and cohesiveness. We're going through each of those pillars. We did a lot of great stuff in 2020 because we just reacted. Now we know we're in this environment. As we look forward, what do we want to do opportunistically? So we're looking at that very keenly. The other thing we do quarterly crisis drills. So, we did drills this year that we hadn't contemplated, such as what do we do if there's a contested election, which we did back during the late summer. I think continuing to challenge ourselves to be ready for anything as a brand and communications function is going to be key.
Yeah, 100%. I'd say from an agency perspective, we've never been relied upon more to look around corners for clients. And I think it's a muscle that just got stronger and stronger as we faced issue after issue after issue. And I hope that that's something that we are able to bottle and spread around and take as a real sort of core competency of what an agency partner should be able to do in a real quick turn. So with that, Tina, I turn it over to you.
Sure. So this was really great and I really appreciate it. It was, and also I felt like this webinar also gives us a lot of hope as people are getting vaccinated, and it looks like, and just by it, like the comms function was so integral and important during COVID-19, the pandemic. And I think there's a lot of positives that come out of it, out of the workplace. So this was a very hopeful, what a great webinar. So my last question was actually Deidre's question. So I'll just, we must have been channeling the same of the crystal ball looking forward. So I'd like to thank our partners at Edelman. This has been a great experience working with them, with Doug and Deidre and Audrey and their team. And thanks so much, Deidre, for moderating. That was fantastic. And a big big thank you to our panelists today, Arielle Patrick, Arati Randolph, and Paul Gennaro. It was really great and insightful. We will, any sort of resources that people put in the chat, we will send those out with the playback of the webinar in the next day or two. So hope everyone has a great day. We look forward to seeing you very soon on a future webinar and hopefully in person in 2021. So
Thank you.
bye, everybody.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you.